The Aryans saw the cow as special, but they also slaughtered her when she was no longer useful. Zeus, the king of the Greek gods, is so similar to Indra, the king of the Vedic gods. Indo-Aryans brought with them a far more subordinate idea of women. Hello and welcome to Indians. I'm Namit Arora. In the previous episode, we looked at the rise and fall of the Harappan civilization in the northwest of the Indian subcontinent. Its decline was most likely caused by regional climate change. A long spell of bad monsoons led to droughts and drove urban Harappans out of their towns and cities. By 1900 BCE, a lot of Harappans had migrated south and east, where they dissolved into the rural life of the subcontinent. Around this time, a brand new group entered India from Central Asia. They called themselves the Arya, meaning the noble ones. Not exactly a winning move in a humility contest. They came in multiple waves between 2000 and 1500 BCE. This influx of the Aryans would become one of the most significant cultural influences on the subcontinent. Their arrival marked the rise of what historians call the Vedic Age, lasting until about 500 BCE, and that's the period we'll look at in this episode. These Aryans or Indo-Aryans were mainly nomadic herders, and their culture was profoundly different from that of the Harappans and their descendants, who were settled farmers. The Aryans rode horses and horse-drawn chariots. The Harappans never used horses. The Aryans had a three-tiered social stratification between priests, warriors, and commoners, whereas no such division is known among the Harappans. The religious cosmology of the Aryans had mostly male gods, such as Indra, Varuna, Surya, Mitra, Agni, Vayu, Rudra. They had a few female ones too, such as Usha and Saraswati, but their presence is quite insignificant compared to the presence of women in the artifacts of the subcontinent, as we saw in the previous episode. The Aryans spoke an early form of Sanskrit called Vedic Sanskrit. Their oral tradition included early forms of the verses of the Rig Veda. A priestly class of Brahmins performed fire rituals and oral chants. They memorized and passed down their magical words and sounds with great precision. The Aryans sacrificed animals to their gods, including cattle, goats, and horses. The Ashwamedh Yagya, a ritual performed by ambitious kings, usually ended with a horse sacrifice. Like other nomadic herders, the Aryans killed and ate male calves as well as older cows that no longer gave milk. As Swami Vivekananda wrote, there was a time in this very India when without eating beef, no Brahmin could remain a Brahmin. But the milk-giving cow also had an elevated and protective status compared to other animals. In other words, the Aryans saw the cow as special, but they also slaughtered her when she was no longer useful. Her special status came from their Central Asian ancestors. Interestingly, the Aryans met the domesticated water buffalo in India, but denied her the same high status, despite being no less useful. Poor buffalo. As part of their rituals, the Aryans also had some fun. They drank an intoxicant called soma. Their gods, especially Indra and Agni, are also described as drinking soma in large quantities. The psychedelic highs of soma were surely quite enjoyable, but for the most part, Vedic religion was ritualistic and sacrificial. It did not yet have ideas like the cycle of samsara, maya, karma, or moksha. From this Vedic religious substrate and the social hierarchy of the Vedic Aryans, would later emerge Brahmanism and the fourfold Varna system. What happened next is super interesting. The incoming Aryans were a relatively powerful and aggressive group. They started settling down and mixing with the locals. Their chariots and their dramatic fire rituals with hypnotic incantations must have mesmerized the locals. The Aryans were light-skinned, while the locals were dark-skinned. A common custom among Aryan men was to take many wives. Genetic studies suggest that Aryan men reproduced with local women at extremely high rates. This would have required displacing or eliminating many local men. It's hard to imagine this happening through some kind of happy cultural exchange between equals. More likely, violence and coercion were involved. Many local women were probably abducted, and most locals would have seen the Indo-Aryans as aggressive intruders. Voluntary or not, all this genetic mixing began creating a new social elite with lighter skin tones than the rest of the population. Within a few generations, the Indo-Aryans and this new mixed elite with lighter skin became a force to reckon with. In a way, the Indo-Aryan strategy was very effective. Through mating, aggressive power, or cultural diffusion, they colonized the minds of a local elite to establish themselves, much like what the Turco-Persians and the British did later. This local elite then started championing Indo-Aryan culture, religion, and language. This became a path to upward mobility in the emerging social order. But it also seems natural that other locals must have resented the growing domination of the alien Indo-Aryan culture. There must have been conflicts, but we don't know what form they took. In parallel, ethnic mixing and internal migration also continued for over 1,000 years. This eventually produced a new social layer that still lives on, especially in the upper caste groups of North India. These groups derive as much as 30% of their paternal ancestry from the Indo-Aryans, compared to low single digits for Dalits and Adivasis of South India. Modern genetics has traced the roots of the Indo-Aryans to the Yamanaya people who lived in the steppes, which are grasslands now in southern Russia and Ukraine. Earlier descendants of the Yamanaya had gone to Europe and West Asia, and later ones came to India. That's why Zeus, the king of the Greek gods, is so similar to Indra, the king of the Vedic gods. It appears that many descendants of the Yamanaya had a social hierarchy based on 3 classes. They ritually sacrificed cows and horses, a practice that the Indo-Aryans inherited. The Yamanaya also spoke a Proto-Indo-European language from which descend all the languages of the Indo-European family, such as Greek, Latin, Persian, Sanskrit, German, and English. Ancient DNA from Indo-European burial sites have revealed their kinship structures, including marital norms. They confirm that Yamanaya lineages were very patriarchal. Take the Indo-Aryans. As I noted earlier, some of their men were super successful in passing on their genes in North India, very likely through violence. They kept women in secondary roles and out of ceremonial rituals. It's true that a few women, mostly wives or daughters of prominent sages, do appear in the Vedas. Gargi and Maitreyi come to mind, but they were the exceptions. Several Yamanaya lineages, including the Indo-Aryans, are known to have valued sati. This gory ritual of burning widows on the funeral pyres of their dead husbands appeared not just in India, but in many parts of the world, notably Europe. The father of Alexander the Great had a Thracian wife who, as part of a custom of her people, was burned on her husband's funeral pyre. The first known mentions of sati in India are also from the same time frame, 4th century BCE. It's just that other regions got rid of the practice of sati long before Indians did. So it's fair to say that the Indo-Aryans brought with them a far more subordinate idea of women than what had prevailed in the subcontinent. The mixing of Indo-Aryans with local women had other outcomes too. One was that Vedic Sanskrit, spoken by Aryan men, began absorbing loanwords from the languages of their local wives. It also absorbed a specific set of sounds called retroflex, such as t, th, d, dh, r. You hear them in words like theek, danda, dhona, bada. These sounds are produced when the tip of your tongue curls upwards to touch the palate. These retroflex sounds are unique to the languages of the subcontinent, and they soon also entered Sanskrit. Allow me to digress a little to talk about a contentious debate in India today. Somehow the idea of Aryans migrating into India has faced great resistance in recent decades. Almost all of it comes from Hindu nationalists, and it's not hard to understand why. They want to see the Aryans as indigenous to India because they want to see Vedic Hinduism as indigenous to Indian society. It's important to their political ideology that cultural elements like Sanskrit, the Rig Veda, and priestly fire rituals are shown as native to India. And so, despite all the evidence, Hindu nationalists insist that the Harappans and the Aryans were one people who spoke Sanskrit. They even see Sanskrit as the mother of all Indo-European languages. They favor the so-called out of India theory, in which the Aryans originated in India and went out from here to give Indo-European languages to the world. These nationalists see the roots of Hindu religion as entirely native, contrasting it with the outsider roots of Islam and Christianity. In their mind, this bolsters their claim of India being a Hindu nation. Fortunately, the science of ancient DNA has now firmly resolved this so-called debate about the origin of the Indo-Aryans. Scholars in the field, based on evidence from linguistics and archaeology, have long supported the Aryan migration theory. Now the study of ancient DNA has revealed our genetic lineages and migration patterns going back thousands of years. And today, there is little scholarly disagreement about this. Aryan migration is a fact, not an opinion. What this also means is that to the extent the Rig Veda, Sanskrit, and priestly fire rituals are seen as the foundations of Hinduism, to that extent, Hinduism too is an outsider religion, arriving with the Aryans from Central Asia. Here is a side note. It's important to realize that the Aryan migration theory is different from the earlier model proposed by the British, the Aryan invasion theory, which was abandoned by scholars many decades ago. The Aryans, it's now clear, came into India over the course of many centuries, and their incoming population was dominated by men. They came with their animal herds and settled across North India. Scholars do not see the patterns of a statist military invasion in it. In other words, the Aryans are best classified as migrants, not invaders, though they surely had many conflicts with the locals, and some locals may have experienced them as invaders. One thing we can be absolutely sure of: never in their wildest dreams could these Aryans have imagined that 3,500 years later, people would be excitedly discussing them and fighting a culture war over their legacy. Okay, back to my narrative. We were talking about a great deal of genetic and cultural mixing between Indo-Aryans and local groups. There was much internal migration. From this churning and mingling came new hybrid cultures. This is also the start of the Iron Age in India. Between 1500 and 1100 BCE, larger political units led by warlike chieftains began coming up, mostly in the fertile Ganga plains. War between these Aryanized tribes, such as the Bharatas and Purus, became a regular feature in the region. These Bharatas would later inspire the geographic terms Bharat and Bharatvarsh. From this substrate and its social conflicts came the early stories of the Mahabharata around 1000 BCE. The earliest bards who told the Mahabharata story may have been charioteers who served as drivers, confidants, and bodyguards to the warriors. While on military campaigns, they recited stories around campfires. No wonder God was a charioteer in the epic. Even Karna was raised by a charioteer. Starting with a king and a fisherwoman as the founders of the Kuru clan, these stories would evolve over centuries as they would be told and retold in countless venues. Each new generation of oral storytellers would add new and exciting masala into it, to a point where it's now very hard to extract any reliable historical data from it. Despite that, the stories of the Mahabharata arguably contain a psychic record of the late Vedic age. It records its evolving values, morals, anxieties, as well as notions of dharma, time, honor, and so on. This great epic also contains echoes of a changing social order, which was moving away from tribal and clan-based units towards becoming hereditary kingdoms ruled by a warrior class. After the arrival of the Indo-Aryans, no cities arose in India for centuries. The Harappan script had disappeared along with their cities, and no other script has been found. It's intriguing that the flame of a literate urban civilization wasn't lit again for over 1,000 years. Perhaps the lack of an urban civilization reduced the need for a script. But while there were no cities or scripts, many cultures kept evolving in the subcontinent. Archaeologists identify them through their pottery and other artifacts such as ochre-colored pottery culture, copper hoard culture, and painted greyware culture. The Pandavas and Kauravas of the Mahabharata would have used such painted greyware pottery. In the late Vedic age, from 1100 to 500 BCE, a large part of North India was called Aryavarth, the land of the Aryans, in which Indo-Aryan culture and languages had become dominant. Brahmanism had become the religion of the social elites, but it still reached only a minority of people. In this social set, and spilling beyond it, the four Varna categories as well as ritual purity and pollution had become common concepts. But there is no evidence yet of a caste system which is about a hierarchy of endogamous groups. Endogamy means marrying within one's own social group. The caste system emerged later when Aryanized notions of purity and pollution got mapped onto occupations and produced both endogamy and hierarchy. Beyond Aryavarth, on all sides, lived the barbarians, or Melech. This term included foreigners to the north as well as people south of the Vindhyas and forest peoples who had very different customs and languages. In popular stories, such people were often imagined as subhuman creatures, grotesque rakshasas, fierce-looking demons, or talking monkeys. Across the north, the ethnically mixed Indo-Aryan elite forged new languages too. We call them Middle Indo-Aryan languages or Prakrits. Examples include Magadhi, Maharashtri, Shauraseni, Pali, Gandhari. In their grammar and vocabulary, these Prakrits were close to Vedic Sanskrit, except that they had the accents, loanwords, and idioms of vernacular languages. In a way, Indian English is also a Prakrit, created by upper-class Indian speakers of British English. Same process. By the late Vedic age, Prakrits were increasingly spoken by the middle and upper classes of the day, while the poor and rural folk continued with their old vernacular languages. Over time, the Prakrits and Indo-Aryan culture gained in the north. By the medieval period, This process would practically wipe out all vernacular languages of North India, replacing them with various Indo-Aryan languages. Interestingly, we now call these Indo-Aryan languages vernacular in relation to English. Meanwhile, in the south, Dravidian languages and post-Harappan and other folk cultures became prominent. Something of this cultural divide still exists in India. In the centuries ahead, forests were cleared and agriculture expanded. New modes of life, specialized trades and professions arose. New states like Kosala, Kamboj, Kashi, Rajgriha, Malla and Vaishali emerged in North India. Many of them had developed money economies with coins as legal tender. Some of these states even experimented with democratic ideas similar to those in Greece. The thing is that if Greece can be called the mother of democracy, so can India. Truth is that both the Indian and the Greek experiments were closer to city scale and not very democratic by modern yardsticks. They were in fact closer to oligarchic republics. Yet they both belong to a plural prehistory of democracy whose examples can be found around the world, not just in India and Greece. What's common to them is their taste for governance through discussion, debate, and voting by a wider cross-section of people. Sadly, as in Greece, these early experiments in India soon collapsed and gave way to monarchies. Indians abandoned these early democratic instincts for 2,500 years and embraced new social hierarchies. Only in modern times would a class of Indians recultivate a taste for democracy after India's collision with Europe. By around 500 BCE, fertile river valleys supported urban centers quite different from those of the urban Harappans. These had been shaped by new hybrid cultures created by the mixing of Indo-Aryans, Harappans, and other ethnic groups that had long been in India. Together, they gave rise to new trades, lifestyles, and a thriving marketplace of spiritual and religious ideas. Even in hindsight, this was one of the most prolific and creative ages in India, its own axial age that would profoundly shape later Indians. It was the age of the Upanishads, which departed from the earlier ritualistic and sacrificial Vedas. The Upanishads were more abstract, inner-directed, and contemplative. It was the age of the Buddha, who spoke of human suffering and compassion, injecting a huge moral dimension in Indian religious thought. It was the age of the Charvaks, the materialists who rejected all afterlife and the Vedas, which they claimed were designed to keep men submissive through fear and rituals. The Charvaks were atheists who mocked religious ceremonies, calling them inventions of the Brahmins to ensure their own livelihood. It was the age of Mahavir, who took the idea of non-violence to new heights. The age of Panini, the grammarian from Gandhara, who forged the classical form of Sanskrit. The age of early medical surgeries that could reconstruct noses chopped off as punishment. Of course, one wonders why so many people had their noses chopped off to create a market for this surgical expertise. Chances are that it had something to do with the rise of new regimes of coercive power in centralized state societies, often at war with each other. Curiously, all this amazing innovation and thought and deed somehow happened without a written script, or at least a script that we know of. The earliest firm evidence of a script in India, a script called Brahmi, comes from Ashoka's edicts of 3rd century BCE. Some scholars have argued that this script arose earlier and evolved for a couple of centuries but was written on materials that have not survived. Still, it's amazing to think that the entire Vedic corpus was composed and transmitted orally for over 1,000 years. Their shlokas required precise pronunciation for their magic to happen, so the Brahmins invested a great deal in memorizing them precisely. They were passed down orally from gurus to students for over 50 generations. That's an impressive feat of organized memory. Until the rise of Buddhism, Brahmanism had the greatest hold on the elites of Aryavart, but it reached only a small minority of the population. While Brahmanism was based on the authority of the Vedas, others like Buddhists, Jains, Charvaks, and Ajivikas rejected the authority of the Vedas. For that reason, they were called Nastik, or members of heterodox traditions in later classifications of Indian philosophy. Interestingly, both Buddhism and Jainism arose at the eastern edges of Aryavart and had the most durable spread also in the east, down Odisha and Andhra Pradesh. Though their founders came from Aryanized groups, these heterodox religions were shaped more by non-Aryan spiritual substrates in the subcontinent, which also helps explain their differences and rivalries with Brahmanism. More on that later in the series. In the next episode, I'll look at the invasion of Alexander the Great and the rise of the first mega empire in India, founded by Chandragupta Maurya. I'll look at it specially through the eyes of Megasthenes, the Greek ambassador to his court. See you next time.